In the second part of our conversation, I want to talk about hazard avoidance and mitigation in the context of coastal storms and hurricanes and in the context of sea level rise hazards. Coastal storm and hurricane hazards, the consequences of that are identifiable on floodplain maps used to identify the flood-prone areas, but that's only part of the issue because land use and infrastructure decisions must provide resilience relative to coastal storms. Hazard mitigation planning identifies location and magnitude of potential impacts of the storm, methods to protect land use and landscape values, and create post-impact strategies for remediation planning. Land use, environmental, and transportation planning are conducted relative to evacuation planning to help minimize or eliminate impacts after the storm occurs. Hurricanes are defined in terms of 5 categories of wind speed and storm surge, ranging on the one hand from a low in Category 1 storms of wind speeds ranging between 74 and 95 miles per hour, with a storm surge of between 4 to 5 feet. Category 3 storms are over 100 miles per hour, top winds 111 to 130, 9 to 12 feet of storm surge. Category 5 storms are greater than 155 mile an hour winds, with storm surge exceeding 18 feet. You can see on the right-hand part of this slide the level of damage that's associated, for example, with a Category 1 storm, basically tree damage and unanchored mobile home damage. A Category 3 storm, destroying mobile homes, large trees down, small buildings damaged, and a Category 5 storm, creating extensive building damage, small buildings destroyed, flooding areas within 15 feet above sea level pretty much everywhere. This map shows tidal inundation patterns for 4 different types of hurricanes in downtown Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia, which is a big naval port on the east coast of the United States. The red areas represent a Category 1 storm. You can see that they are fairly isolated. There aren't very many of them. They're not very large. As we move up to the Category 2 storm in orange, and especially to the Category 3 storm in yellow, we begin to see extensive portions of both downtown Norfolk and downtown Portsmouth that are susceptible to inundation by a Category 3 storm. And then finally, when we get up to a Category 4 storm, almost everything is inundated. All of the yellow area, all of the red area, all of the orange area, and all of the purple area. So different types of storms have different intensities and different spatial extents associated with their tidal inundation regime. Hurricane strike frequency along the East Coast varies from once every 20 years in the far northeastern part of the United States down to once every 4 to 6 years in Cape Hatteras on the Outer Banks in North Carolina, South Florida, and the Mississippi River Delta. On the one hand, I grew up in New York State, approximately right here, and in the 1950s, we had in a zone that we're supposed to have 1 storm every 21 years, we had 3 storms in 5 years. So these likelihood of events need to be tempered to a certain extent. I want to do an anatomy of a particular storm event that occurred, Hurricane Sandy, which was a Category 2 storm on October 25th of 2012. It came out of the Caribbean and came up along the East Coast. By the time it got to North Carolina, it was pretty much heading due north, and then it took landfall in northern New Jersey and New York City. The map on the right shows the tidal flood surge that occurred, the variation in tidal flood surge, and we had in the New York area, on Long Island and in New York City in particular, a flood surge of anywhere from 9 to 11 feet to 13 to 15 feet. So we had suddenly a significant increase in flood, tidal range, which produced a significant amount of damage. As we can see in this particular diagram, we see buildings in New York City and in Atlantic City that are completely inundated. These maps are interesting because they show on the lower left, they show tidal inundation occurring from Hurricane Sandy. The storm evacuation zone shows those different zones based upon likelihood of impact, from a zone A having a highest risk of flooding from a hurricane storm surge to zone C having a low likelihood of evacuation being needed in New York City. So we can see that there are extensive portions of New York City in red here that are within the zone, the evacuation zone A, having highest risk of flooding from a hurricane storm surge. The map with the blue lines on it, the blue lines represent subway tunnels that were flooded during Hurricane Sandy, and there were several subway lines that were down for quite a long period of time. The wind damage associated with Hurricane Sandy was quite significant. We see in the lower right-hand corner a very large tree that's basically broken in half, snapped in half. We see damage to siding and roof structure, extensive structural damage occurring. Damage in the boroughs of New York City was quite extensive. We see in the left-hand side the extent of Staten Island that was inundated by storm surge. And this orange area along the right-hand side of Staten Island, you can very faintly see lines underneath of it. Those lines are called streets. And so all of these communities down in through here were pretty much completely inundated. The inundation you see on the right-hand side was in the Far Rockaways on Long Island. And you can see waves crashing through a Gulf station in the Far Rockaways. I want to talk about the storm coming through North Carolina because it actually never made landfall in North Carolina. It so-called, as the weather people said, it brushed by the Carolina shore. But in brushing by the Carolina shore, it tore up a long-standing pier, fishing pier. We see the ocean inundating significant portions of commercial area, and we see significant structural damage associated with both the wind and the storm occurring in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and Nags Head, North Carolina. This is an interesting map because it shows a couple of things. First of all, it shows the coastal evacuation routes. These red lines represent evacuation routes where they literally, when a storm is predicted, they turn the routes into speedways where everything is one way leaving the Outer Banks. And the speed limits, all of the intersections are controlled by state police. And so the idea is to get people out of the Outer Banks as quickly as possible by these evacuation highway system. Located along the evacuation highway system are emergency services for people leaving the Outer Banks. So through traffic flow management and through provision of emergency services, then the idea is to get people out of the Outer Banks as quickly as possible. Second thing I want to talk about relative to this map is the green line shows the storm track. This is essentially the orientation of the storm as it brushed past the Outer Banks. Mind you, it did not make landfall here. It's 50 miles offshore. As the storm was coming up the coast, it was moving, the winds were circulating in a counterclockwise direction, such that when the storm came ashore, the wind was out of the northeast. So it was blowing straight out of the northeast, blowing the ocean up against the Outer Banks, pretty much which have a northwest to southeast trajectory. And then when the storm passed by and the wind turned around, the southwesterly winds were blowing back up against the backside. Well, the significance of this is that the winds at the start of the storm out of the northeast were blowing all of the water out of Currituck Sound and Pamlico Sound, blowing all of that water back up into the upland areas. So all of these brown areas that you see here, the beige areas, were areas that were inundated by water being pushed by the wind out of Currituck Sound and Pamlico Sound. And then as the storm turned around, all of that water was blown back out across the Outer Banks. So really the flooding damage that occurred on the Outer Banks was associated not so much with the onset of the storm, but with the effects of the storm as it was blowing the water back out of the lowland area of the mainland. This is an account by a local resident who happened to be my brother, who lived out on the Outer Banks at the time. He says, at about 7:30, the wind shifted from the northeast to the southwest. Currituck Sound rose by 7.5 feet in 30 minutes. The force of the wind and water busted the latch and opened the back door in the garage. By the time I had secured it, 18 inches of water was in the garage. Water flooded over the door of the sills of the Avalon and Mazda. The truck, I think, was okay. Water has since dropped to 11 inches, but the current wind, 40 miles per hour out of the southwest, seems to be as low as it's going for now. Also about to lose the rear stairs from the back duct to the ground. The front away from Currituck Sound is okay. So mitigation strategies relative to coastal storm hazards are associated with restoring coastal vegetation and wetlands, beach nourishment, elevating or removing structures from the areas immediately adjacent to flood areas, modifying construction standards, flood insurance, emergency preparedness, and disaster assistance. Maps on the upper left show the Mississippi River Delta in 1839, and you can see that wetlands extended considerably out into the Gulf of Mexico. Those wetlands had a very beneficial effect in terms of storm mitigation because they created resistance to the tidal surge. They slowed the tidal surge down and reduced the volume of water that was going to be impacting upstream communities, and particularly New Orleans. By 1993, because of the variety of things happening on the mainland and in places like Minnesota, you can see that a significant amount of those tidal wetlands had moved. And the consequence was then that storms that occur now no longer have that buffer of wetlands to slow them down and mitigate the flood surge. We see efforts then on in the Delta to create new wetland protection areas to try to help mitigate the effect of current storms. Another strategy is called beach nourishment. This is the idea of importing sand or gravel and placing it along the face of dunes. In the upper left-hand image, we see the original wave scour zone was at the foot of the dune. The idea then is you import sand or gravel and spread it across the beach. And in the middle diagram, you can see then the original beach profile where the breaker zone was immediately adjacent to land use occurring on the main portion of the land. With beach nourishment, the idea is to flatten the shoreline profile to minimize wave scouring and widen the beach to protection from wave scouring. In other words, we're moving the scour zone away from the development and pushing it out further into the ocean. And the idea then is waves break there and have a much longer surface over which to travel both up and back down again. We see on the right-hand side then the effects of beach nourishment on expanding the beach in the in North in coastal North Carolina. So the idea of nourishment is, as I said, flatten the profile of the beach and move the breaker zone further out away from the main land. Coastal storms also can be mitigated through dune protection, dune creation, and having large structural setbacks to accommodate floodwater. So we can see in comparison with the upper two diagrams where buildings are located right up to the edge of the beach in various configurations. In the lower diagram, we see the retention of dune areas, the protection of vegetation on those dune areas, large setbacks to push the buildings as far back from the dune area as is possible. The dune provide them a sense of first level of protection, and if water breaches the dune or cuts through the dune, then the area behind the dune is left undeveloped to accommodate the floodwater after the dune is breached. We see the diagram in the lower right here with a fairly extensive area on the back side of the dune, and areas where the water is actually allowed to inundate and is accommodated in this large open space area, and the same number of dwelling units that were existing in the other development patterns are placed here, but they're placed at a much higher density and in areas that are further removed from the coastal zone area, and they're protected by the dune restoration and management area, and they're protected by the floodwater accommodation area. In Europe, in the Netherlands, where much of the country is below sea level, they have a program called Making Room for the River. This is along the Rhine River in this image in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where they actually acquire land immediately adjacent to the river, purposely set it aside with the idea that every year that land is going to be inundated with floodwater from the Rhine River. So this is, again, the notion of a flood accommodation, accommodating the natural cycle of flooding, letting that water flood onto, in this case, pasture land, where it will accommodate the flood water, allow the water to hang around for a while and gradually dissipate over time. Coastal storms can be mitigated in terms of elevating structures. We see in the upper diagram here structures built at grade, and the base flood elevation of the 100-year storm is creating surf that's literally overtopping the structure itself and creating significant amount of damage by water impacting the structure itself, and then by the structure being filled with sand. Raising the elevation of the structure in the area that's impacted allows the water to pass underneath. I mentioned that my brother lived out on the Outer Banks. He lived on the back side of the island, but his house, you had to walk up 14 stairs to get to the front door of his house. So the elevation of the house was 14 feet above the mean sea level. One other thing about his house, I mentioned the notion of building standards. His roof was secured to the foundation of the building, and it had to be able to withstand a 500-mile-an-hour wind. That's built right into the building code standards. So not only are they elevating structures to allow the flood surge to pass underneath of the development pattern, but they are reinforcing the structures to try to be able to accommodate the wind speeds that you see in a hurricane storm. Sea level rise is something that in the last 30 years, certainly we've heard a lot about. Here we see sea level rise associated with a 2-meter inundation of Southeast Asia. Here in the United States, we see a 1.5-meter inundation in the red area, affecting the delta of the Mississippi River, affecting far south Florida, affecting portions of the coastline along the United States, especially in North Carolina. and in Maryland. And then we see areas that would be inundated by a 1.5 to 3.5 meters. So the idea here is to get a handle on what is the spatial extent of the areas that would be inundated by varying levels of sea level rise. This is a map showing a 6-meter increment, which is approximately 19 to 20 feet. So here we can begin to talk about mapping for a fairly significant level of sea level rise. Here we can see a 5-meter sea level rise, which is the projected impact. What you're seeing here in red represents the area that is projected to be inundated should the Greenland ice sheet melt. So we're talking about significant damage in South Florida because all of this red area in the left-hand diagram is urban development called Miami and Miami Beach. And a good chunk of that, in fact, all of that, as you can see on the right-hand map, is underwater in a 5-meter sea level rise. Here we see sea level rise in Norfolk, Virginia, areas that are below 1.5 meters of rise and areas that are 1.5 to 3.5 meters of rise. So these maps become as important as the hurricane inundation maps because they begin to give us a sense that, hey, you know what, these areas are quite likely to change over time. We ought to be treating them differently than we're treating the areas that are beige in color.